Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the YWCA's virtual stand against racism. We're welcoming everyone back for another week of great conversation and discussion around racial and social justice. I'm Jessica Gershenfeld, one of the case managers here at the YWCA. Today we're going to be talking about engaging in difficult conversations regarding racial inequity. And I just want to kind of go over, I know in the past, mostly all attendees and participants have been asking their questions through the Q&A, but I do just let everyone know that if you want to raise your hand and ask a question live, that's also an option. Or if you want to give any input, that's great as well. We'll just save that for the question and answer part after the beginning discussion. And I just want to say we haven't had any issues so far, but just remind everyone to be respectful to each other, the other attendees and our speakers. We want to talk about the challenging conversation, but we want to do it in a respectful way so that everyone's comfortable to, ask what they want to ask. On that note, I will pass it over once again to Guillaume Stewart, YWCA's Executive Director.
Thank you, Jess. I just want to echo Jess' sentiment about how great these weekly dialogues have been. As a committee, we talk every week about the topic, we talk about the feedback we get, and the feedback from you has been really incredible. You've raised great questions, you've asked tough questions, and that's been a real asset to these dialogues. I'm so excited to have Dr. Ashley E. Stewart as a part of this conversation today. I just want to read a little bit about her amazing work that she does in her career. Again, Dr. Ashley Stewart Phd is an assistant professor and higher education administrator at Temple University. As an educator, Dr. Stewart promotes self-awareness, advocacy skills, and practice skills through the lens of decolonialization and anti-oppression. As a social work researcher, she's passionate about the translational aspects of research for policy, advocacy, and for social change. Dr. Stewart's main research interests are in accountability measures for reducing mental and physical health disparities resulting from institutionalized forms of racism and identity-based structural oppression. Dr. Stewart also conducts research on developing best practice for web-based support spaces for minoritized communities. So that is a lot of great work. We're excited to have Dr. Stewart here. How are you today, Dr. Stewart? Thank you for being here. We're gonna get right into it. Tell us a little bit about your interests in higher education, teaching on that level, conducting research on that level, and being an administrator in higher education. How do you become passionate about that work that you do?
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, super pumped and excited to be here. Very grateful to YWCA for inviting me to speak. How do I get passionate about? Well, higher education has been something that has always been a passion of mine. I saw it as an opportunity and an avenue to gain access to different resources, to be able to better prepare myself to engage with the social issues that I've always been passionate about. And the further that I went into higher education, the more resource or opportunity that was presented to me to be able to then apply that skill or begin to engage in some critical conversations about how social issues were impacting people's wellness, mental health, physical, psychological, physiological, all of it and above. And so I found higher education and the different roles that I've occupied in higher education and great spaces to hold these conversations and to build better accountability measures.
Yeah. That's all. I just want to tell our listeners, the more I talk with you, the more the committee engaged with you. We felt like we were back in school. We got so much good information that we think would be an asset to the listeners. So thank you for helping us to learn and helping us to grow around some critical issues. One of the things that you pointed out in our conversations is this concept of intersectionality. And you really made a lot of powerful comments about that. Can you just explain to our viewers what that means to you as a conceptual framework?
Yeah, definitely. So intersectionality, and I'm very passionate when using terms to really honor the true definition of it, what it means, what the scholars who developed it intend for it to mean. And intersectionality really begins to look at the intersections of spaces where people are experiencing forms of oppression. And so while I've heard intersectionality be described as just multiple identities, it's really taking a critical analysis to say, okay, this person might be experiencing discrimination or oppression in one aspect of their life as a person of color, as a Black person, and then they may also be experiencing oppression as a woman. And those two things, moving against an essentialism kind of perspective to say that those two things come together and create a different reality that perpetuates a different level of struggle or challenge or barrier or opportunity to be involved.
Yeah, and I think that's important to point out as we engage in the question. That's the central point of our conversation, is how do we have difficult conversations with people about race and about inequity? So getting some foundational knowledge about intersectionality and things that you do in your work, I think will help us. So I want to throw a couple of other questions at you, some concepts that we've been thinking about based on our conversation. Can you talk a little bit about what's the relationship between wellness and oppression?
Yes. So there's lots of relationships between wellness and oppression, and particularly forms of oppression can create barriers to wellness. I think that for us to really begin that conversation, oppression is a word that a lot of people aren't comfortable with, and beginning to break down any misconceptions that we have about oppression and understanding that it's systemically and structurally rooted, ways in which barriers, limitations, differential treatment of people has been woven into the systems that create culture, that create policies, that create the platforms in which we exist in our day-to-day lives. And so if we think about how something as specific as racism, for example, as a form of oppression is woven through our society, well, at every stop in terms of the system of culture within the US, if we're talking about United States of America perspective, is engaging with people's wellness. So as I navigate to the store or in my workplace or in terms of art, it's everywhere. So when we think about wellness and we think about it holistically, we have to have that appreciation that oppression doesn't exist on any particular level, but it is a ubiquitous concept as well.
Yeah. And I think that point you just made about how people of color or people that experience oppression have to contemplate what that means when we go out into the world. So a trip to the local store, a trip to a park, you have to contemplate, how does this impact, how does my color or my gender or any of those spaces that you alluded to, how does that impact how the world perceives me? That feels like a lot of work that people...
And there's research that shows that it expends a lot of energy. And it's one of those things where you might not, an individual might not have that context, right? If you don't have to make that many decisions, I talk about privilege often being the things that we don't have to think about. If you're not making those decisions on a concerted effort and energy to make those decisions on a daily basis, you might not even be able to empathize with how oppression is affecting someone's wellness, or maybe even for yourself, not realizing that that energy that is expended very regularly in processing how to navigate an oppressive system is affecting us. So to be honest and transparent and talk about it begins to break down some of those barriers.
Right. And I think that's important. So if I'm a person who wants to have these conversations with my coworkers or with my friends or, people in my community, knowing this background that oppression, based on what you've just been describing, oppression does impact wellness, even on a physical level. Is that correct to say?
Yeah. There's lots of research to support that as well. Yeah, when you look at stress-related conditions, especially ones that disproportionately affect communities of color, specifically Black people, a lot of them are related to stress-induced diseases or disorders, and that could be related to a lot of things, but we cannot undermine the fact that that in part oppression plays a critical role in that.
Yeah. I want to get to a couple other concepts that you shared that I think will be helpful for our listeners. And it was just, once we were talking, it made me want to look up stuff, and I was reading and trying to keep up and catch up with these concepts that you were discussing. What is this concept of generational trauma and race-based trauma?
Yes. Oh, good question. So race-based traumatic stress really looks at the forms of life stressors. Those could be, these could be like covert or overt things that people are experiencing. They could be subtle. They could be very blatant ways in which people's experiences with their racial identity is in direct relationship to the stress that they're experiencing. And so race-based traumatic stress can manifest in a lot of different ways. Some of the symptoms could be similar to what we see in anxiety or depression, or even some post-traumatic stress disorder symptomology. But it really, the work of race-based traumatic stress really attempts to not pathologize the experience, but acknowledge that racism is having these long-term health consequences. And then the other term that you brought up was, what was it?
That was the generational
trauma.
Yes.
So, and then folks learn, parents, guardians, aunts, whomever, we learn how to navigate a society, and that, and thinking critically about how to keep yourself safe is then translated into how to keep other generations safe, or what we have learned through the data points that we've developed in life about how we're treated, or what might be threats, or what are the best ways to protect ourselves or advance ourselves, then begins to be passed down. So I had a personal experience this the other day, where I was thinking about how I was navigating society, with my mask on and things like that. And I started to think about, how would I talk to my children about this? And so it wasn't necessarily a conversation about like how to wear a mask or not to wear a mask and navigating global pandemic, but it was a question about how do you do so safely? And so reiterating that message that your safety could be called into question depending on what you're wearing or how you're engaging with society is the trauma that I've experienced for my fear, that is a safety mechanism that I would then be sharing with children.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I appreciate you sharing that. I just want to add to that and say, I felt that too. Like sometimes I think if it's on a weekend and I'm dressed down, and I think, I'm going to the Wawa, do I look like I'm dressed as a Crip or a Blood? Like that goes through my mind to think like, how are people going to perceive me when I go there? Or if I have a hat on, baseball hat on, do I look to whatever? And these are things that I think people of color have to navigate just in everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I know when we had a conversation earlier, we kind of talked about how those realities compound, right? So that is a micro decision that you make in the day about how to go. But when you're making multiple of those decisions, and that's an everyday decision you're making about how to engage with society, that has a cumulative impact.
Mm. Yeah, and now you can see that. So when you talk about the cumulative impact, the compounded impact, all these micro decisions are weighing heavy on people that I'm guessing relates to some of the stress that people of color feel, and then the lack of general wellness is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, and everyone experiences stress differently. So certainly, but one of the things that I'm very passionate about are people who aren't realizing that these decisions or this energy that's being expended might be directly related to the stress that they're experiencing. And the reason why there's usually that gap is because these are the things that people will typically minimize. No one will care. Like they weren't looking at you that way. Like it's a protective mechanism that we tend to use to support people that can really be invalidating what they have come to develop as a critical perception of how they're navigating through society. You don't have to worry about that when you are going into the meeting. They're going to know you're great. They might have, biases that I'm entering in the room, and based on lived experiences, I know that to be true. And so with that minimalization that we typically do within our communities, within our friend groups, within our coworker groups, really can perpetuate that type of stress and not give people the space to process it.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing during our conversations that I found interesting is the YWCA has been an organization for many years that believed in social equity, believed in racial justice, and also believed in empowering women. The history of the Y in that regard is really impressive. I spent a year just studying the history of women's empowerment and racial justice work that the Y has been committed to, and I think is really valuable work. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about your experience as a professional, a high-level professional in a large institution, and a woman of color, and how that impacts you along these things that you research?
Yeah, sure. So certainly my identities are at the forefront. They're this is something I think about every single day, not some days, but every single day. And I'm very cognizant, I'm very aware of that. It manifests in some overt ways and some overt ways throughout my experiences navigating to, the different spaces that I've occupied, rather. And also it gives me a critical lens. So when we talk about like diversity, I feel as though the perception that I take is that it's critical, it's essential. It's not something that we debate about whether or not we need in the space, but the lived experiences that folks have when they have diverse backgrounds is critical to the functioning of our organizations, of our universities, of whatever space, of our families, of our culture groups. And so for me, it was about understanding what I was experiencing. So I talk a lot about, I got into race equity work when I was introduced in undergrad to the concept of microaggressions. And it's interesting how that concept kind of led me to where I am now, because it gave me a language to describe what I had been internalizing. And I know that microaggressions has taken a lot of shifts in terms in how it's been utilized. But when we really get to the original definition of it, it's talking about subtle ways in which people are put down, or stereotypes are perpetuated onto people, or slights that are made to people to make them not feel welcome. And so I was experiencing these things on a compounding level repeatedly over and over again, and it was having an impact on me, right? Like in a way that wasn't like, I'm experiencing this and I'm frustrated because this is related to the intersections of my identity. I didn't have that context or that framework. All I knew is that I was really sick of my college friends saying, Ashley's the loud one and we'll just blame things on her, right? So I'm like, I'm not even that loud. But it was, So when I think about like my experience, it was really about being able to understand what I was experiencing, and then being able to use that then knowledge to go into race equity work. And not everyone who lives the experience wants to do race equity work. That's just personally what I'm passionate about. Studying health and wellness in my undergrad, in my associates, and even before that, I knew that there was something that was missing in terms of my passion, and that was looking at the holistic ecological perspective of how wellness is affected by societal conditions. And that's, been a big part of my work.
Yeah, that's really, I think, powerful. And I think you've given all of us some foundational knowledge and concepts that we can work with as we move through this conversation. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions from our viewers about this. But I wanted to ask you, what are some things people can do who want to have these conversations? What can they do? Are there some practical steps we can take if we want to talk to people about race issues? There's racial trauma, generational trauma, inequity against women that they experience in society. How do we have these conversations with people? And I'll throw in a bonus question for you is, how do we deal with resistance? What if there's resistance to these kind of talks? How do we manage that?
Yeah, well, my first part was going to be, be prepared for the resistance. And that's an acknowledging that people are inevitably going to be at different places and readiness to have these conversations. And that's going to be based on their life experience. That's going to be on their, the things that they've had access to in terms of having conversations about these things. Some folks have never really had to challenge themselves or engage in these types of difficult conversations. So it's about having an expectation of engaging people at different levels, depending on when and where the conversation's happening. You know, the conversation in the office looks very different than the conversation at the dinner table. And so a few things that I think that I have found helpful, or that, you know, my students have told me have been helpful, especially lately, people have been waiting for this like resource list, and they're ready to engage in this conversation once they have that resource list. And so the first thing that I say for folks who are ready to, or willing to, or want to engage in these types of conversations is access the information that's available. And most importantly, don't wait for someone to bring it to you. Don't wait for the class that you're going to take in college that's going to go over it. Don't wait for some celebrities' book list. There is a wealth of information. And part of the issue is that information that is presented, true narratives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color that is presented isn't necessarily prioritized, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And in fact, there's a wealth of information that is readily accessible to people that just doesn't get prioritized. I don't believe in the concept of voiceless folk, but people whose voices aren't being listened to, and challenging that notion why. So people will tell me, you know, I feel like I use this type of conversation to fish for data. You know, like, I have to like come up with something quick to respond to. But really, when having these conversations, there's more than enough data to support, you know, that racism is an issue, that inequity is an issue, that that people are being disproportionately affected by social problems. There's no shortage of information on that. It's just that we're not accessing it, or we're waiting for someone to give it to us. And so the first thing I tell people is just, you know, go out, get the information, seek the information. The other thing is to start with the question of, how are you going into the question? If you're going into a conversation, you're going into the conversation prepared to have a discussion, to debate someone's humanity, and you're already navigating from a place of privilege that continues to dehumanize a group of people. And so, you know, having that critical lens, having that appreciation for the conversation before you go into it is also very important. The last thing that I think is especially helpful in terms of having deeper level conversations, rather superficial conversations, is realizing that a lot of times people bounce back to perception. Well, that's how folks see it, right? I've had really great conversations with people who hold different forms of power that will say the community has this perception of. Well, the appreciation that has to be navigated before we engage in that conversation is that perception is based in reality, and that folks have had different data points that they've collected through their lives, whether that's because they've learned it through their family members, through that historical generational lens, or that they've experienced themselves, that they've experienced vicariously by watching and observing things happen to other people who look like them, that shape the way that they experience life and their perception of things. And so if you find yourself minimizing anyone's perception, then that's a good place to go and find a new way to interject and begin that conversation, to say, we need to shift and have this conversation differently, because now I'm challenging perception, which is based on reality, and we need to have a real conversation about that.
Yeah, I think that I really like that last point, because I've heard a lot of times people say, well, you know, my grandfather, he's from a different generation, he thinks like this. And they feel like a conversation with granddad has to be like, I'm gonna break him down. I'm gonna, you know, come at him and make him see what I need him to see, or grandma, or whatever. But what I hear you saying is understanding that granddad has certain perceptions that he's collected over time that constitutes his reality, and then letting that inform our approach to talking to him.
Well, it might be that this family member doesn't have information. They have learned through society what has been given to them, and that's why I start with education as the first part, because the way to counter that is to be able to provide people with true narratives and with true stories that counter that. But then the other part of it is that it might be that family member who's resistant to talking about racism might have preconceived notions about how the marginalized, the oppressed group is perceiving their reality. And that's the part that I think is most critical, is if you're having a conversation about how a Black person is perceiving their experiences with racism, we're starting out in the wrong place, because we cannot begin to debate how a Black person is perceiving something, because that perception is built in reality.
I think that's so, and that I'm thinking, based on your research, could go to what a person of color might be experiencing, but also what women experience in society, in the workplace, any group that's basically feels discrimination or minoritized. Yeah. So yeah, that's an important thing. Speaking of women and minoritized groups, I thought our conversation, we all watched the tragic murder, of course, of George Floyd. A whole nation, a whole world responded to it. And in our conversations, we brought up Breonna Taylor. And we kind of talked a little bit about women in the justice system, women who experience some of the brutality in society by law enforcement and others, but may not have gotten all of the attention or all of the awareness that so many other cases have. I think it would be valuable to our readers, our listeners, to hear some of your thoughts on that. Some of the things that women of color experience, including brutality in society, police brutality.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we started off with talking about intersectionality, and anyone who, has really done any digging on intersectionality probably has come across Kimberly Crenshaw's the video TED Talk about intersectionality. And one of the reasons why that one particular, the urgency of intersectionality is so popular is because it demonstrated to people how little we know about injustices that are happening to women of color, and in that particular TED Talk, Black women. And, we would be not having a real conversation if we didn't talk about the oppressive system that is sexism. And when we're talking about the things that people are uncomfortable engaging with, people aren't just uncomfortable talking about racism, people are uncomfortable talking about sexism, misogyny, and people are uncomfortable with talking about patriarchy. And so we interject ourselves into the conversation at the point where we feel most comfortable. We're not really feel comfortable talking about racism. We're more talking about comfortable racism when it affects men. And we're really uncomfortable talking about the experiences of women because of this large scale oppression that is sexism, that is patriarchy, that we aren't even getting to the conversation that talks about the realities for women of color. The realities of trans folk, that is the place where people haven't pushed their margin of comfort yet. And so the cost and the consequence of that is desperate neglect of women of color that don't get talked about, that don't get acknowledged, and that continue to be underrepresented in our conversations about equity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know as an educator, you work with a lot of young students and students who are, working to get their education. What's some of the advice you give to younger generations that want to engage in these conversations and want to have, whether it's a race, whether it's women, the oppression that women feel, trans community feels? How can a young person mobilize their energy and have this conversation with people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first and foremost, bring honor to the folks who have had the privilege and honor to speak. I actually have students of all wide variety of ages, so I just say honor to those folks as well. But especially when talking with younger folk or folk who are in the process of developing, there's two things that come to mind. One is specifically about how to address it. The other is how to be well in addressing it. So when you're learning and diving deeply into this knowledge, it can be very overwhelming, especially if you relate to the oppression, if it is your personal experience. And, or the experience of one that you can relate to vicariously. So there tends to be a very large emotional response that comes with it. And so to honor that, to acknowledge that and to make sure that we're creating spaces for people to heal and process through the realization when all of the things that we've known to be true start to come to the surface, or when you start to realize if you don't identify with the group, the people that you care about, the people you love, your friends, your classmates, whomever that is, are living a very different reality than you, is going to be an emotional response. So be ready for that. And know that that's part of the process and being prepared to have these conversations. If you're not uncomfortable, if you are not processing it emotionally, if you aren't upset, angry, enraged, sad, happy, joyful, if you're not experiencing a range of emotions, then you might not be at the place where you're really digging deeply into the concepts or understanding how things have been, how society has been functioning for people. So that emotional part is part of the process. And then the other part about it is to, really be intentional about how you have the conversations. When the first time we engage in these difficult conversations, might not be in that heat of the moment when it really needs to be addressed. For example, I see a lot of young folks trying to have this conversation with their parents or family members and try to explain to maybe some of the other generations of their family how people of color have been experiencing oppression. And they go into the conversation ready and emotionally charged to have the conversation, but without having the processing of the information. And so we want to make sure that folks feel supported in having those conversations. And so I think that's a really big part of it too.
Yeah, and I think, well, before I comment on that point, let me just say this. I think one of the things we've seen as an organization over the last few weeks is people saying, I want to be involved. People from all walks of life just saying, how can I make impact? How can I change my community or society? And then when we were engaging with these people, they kept asking, well, it's hard to bring up these topics to, fill in the blank. What we're also trying to help people do is how do we build, I guess, resiliency in people around this topic? Because I'm of the belief that it takes resiliency. You may not always get the wins that you want the first conversation or the first community group you have. How can we help people keep bouncing back and keep being resilient around these important critical issues?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so engaging in even the topic that we selected today is very nuanced. It depends on what perception, what perspective rather we're coming into the conversation with, and what's the goal of the conversation. But I think too, there's work which is The Task of the Privileged and Subjugated. It's work by Dr. Ken Hardy, and he talks about building a thicker skin. Now that language isn't language that I would particularly use, but the concept of it is that you may not be received well, especially if you are of the privileged identity in the conversation, because as I mentioned earlier, people's perception is based in their reality. So you might, want to stand in solidarity and might be met with resistance, and that's part of the process. And so developing that resilience to say, this is something I'm committing to, I'm going to continue to learn, I'm going to continue to engage, and I'm going to continue to show up, even if I'm not welcomed with open arms, like welcome into the space of solidarity. There's a lot of harm that has been done to communities, a lot of distrust that exists. And so if you're committed to this work, you have to be committed to the resilience that comes with enduring these conversations and them not always going the way that you envision or imagine them to go. And then I think that, the experience of another one of the tasks, actually, I think as well to this conversation is to, there's always an effort to comfort people and to make people comfortable. And so we certainly don't want to engage in a conversation that creates more barriers by, attacking folks who are having these difficult conversations. But we do need to push against that natural urge to maintain this level of comfort for people who have the privileged identity in the conversation. This is the reality. These are people's lived experiences, and we have to be unapologetic about not continuing to perpetuate that idea that people who cause harm should be made comfortable as they learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think our agency, because we care about social justice right from the very beginning, we keep trying to find ways to be resilient as an agency and keep having these conversations and keep engaging people. And sometimes we do encounter people who don't want to hear from us, people who say, why are you talking about this? Why are you, bringing this program to the school or to this camp or whatever? And we always talk about how we have to be resilient. And so I think what you're describing plays into that too. Being able to know that like everyone's not going to be comforted by a tough conversation, but being have that tough conversation and be comfortable with that discomfort. So that's something that I think, yeah, that's something I think it's a part of the process. I think that's something we can learn. So I just listening to what you said, I had another question. You talked about this, just to circle back to the health disparities that people who experience oppression is experiencing in their wellness. What are some things they can do to deal with the physical issues that they're experiencing, this stress-related trauma?
Yeah. So there are quite a few things. I think that the one of the things that is critically important is being able to be in spaces where those realities can be validated, because inevitably there's going to be a lot of resistance that's met with invalidation. Oh, you took that wrong, or no. We actually, there's a term for it about micro-invalidations that comes out of Daryl Wing Sue's work on microaggressions. I see that there's a question about microaggressions too. And so one is to be in spaces where we can be validated in our realities, and experience joy without, the guilt of it. I know we kind of had a conversation about experiencing guilt with taking time for wellness, realizing that the stressors, whether they're micro stressors that compound or whether it's just like a very heavy event that you have experienced, prioritizing taking wellness. So, there are going to be certain boundaries that we must create for our own wellness. And for me, I will not watch any of the videos of people being murdered. I cannot. I believe that there's enough to support that it happened, but I won't watch it for myself. And that was a boundary that I had to create after realizing the emotional and psychological toll it was taking on me to continuously watch those videos. And sometimes they would just pop up and start playing without me actively clicking on it. So I had to make that like concerted effort. Being surrounded by and supported by people. We always talk about self-care and social work, and one thing that I like to say about self-care is, there are a lot of ways that we could list off self-care, but self-care is really about what makes you feel good. And if a lot of us haven't taken that time to assess what brings me happiness, what brings me joy, what helps me get into a space where I feel whole, where I can have peace. Identifying what that is a form of self-care. And for some people, that's taking a stand. And for some people, it's making quiet time for themselves, and working on not feeling guilty about that.
Yeah, I think that is really important. I just hope that our listeners and viewers are taking that in, the importance of creating these boundaries and practicing and learning self-care for yourself. That is really important. I want to put a pause on my questions because I see we have a lot of questions coming through from our viewers. And so Jess will probably rejoin us and ask some of the questions that we have posted.
I'm back.
There she is.
And that's awesome. Thank you, Ashley. That was great, the whole thing. So we're going to just start. I know you can probably see the Q&A too. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to read that first one out loud, and then maybe if you want to kind of talk about any of your maybe own experiences with that, or give some further input on that first point. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Okay. So it says, for the listeners, it says some people of color are rejected by other people of color because they talk and act white. So Ashley, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So there is, there's a lot of scholarship, but also true narratives that talk about this as well. And so when there is a systemic and structural expectation for what is proper way to talk, or what is, this is going to be very individual to people, but I can speak to it from, my own perspective. I knew that in navigating systems of oppression, there were certain ways that I would need to talk or act or behave in order to have opportunities. And that's a problem. Okay, so that's the first big problem. The other problem with that is that that is then normalized as the right way to do things. And so, but it's also maybe not reflective of how I personally would engage culturally with other people in my community. And so that is internalized on two different levels, on the level that it is a reality for me to engage with society, and on the reality that has been bought into by people within my own community, that is engaging outside of the norm. And so I wonder if we addressed the systemic and structural oppression that is, that there's a right way to be scholarly, or a right way to talk or to communicate or talk white or things like that, which that's a very specific example, then we would really begin to get to the root that messaging translates into communities of color, and then creates a disjoint that says that, that there is a right or wrong way to speak, and that can make people feel isolated. Yeah. And so I honor folks who have that experience, who have felt marginalized because they're trying to exist in society in a particular way, but also therefore are maybe not feeling accepted within their communities as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think when I hopped back on, I didn't let all the attendees know, just to remind everybody that you can put questions in the chat, or you can, raise your hand and ask a question if you have them. For the rest of the time, we'll kind of go over some attendees' questions. The next question says, what are some questions that we can begin to ask ourselves in an effort to become further aware of our own privilege?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that a big part of it begins with having a critical understanding. And sorry, I'm kind of like looking at the other questions coming up. I think that a big part of that is to understand ourselves. So a lot of times we'll want to engage with these conversations because we think that it's an important thing to do, or because we want to just be part of the conversation. And so even when talking about other people's oppression, it can be an underlying reality of a savior complex. I think that my voice is, going to be better received. Well, as an individual, I need to really begin to ask myself that question of, do I feel as though my voice is better perceived because I am identifying with this hierarchy that has been established culturally through systems of oppression? And that's why I feel, is that the positionality that I'm coming into this conversation with? Or am I doing so with an appreciation that my privilege, that I get to have this conversation, that I'm engaging in this conversation with, is part of a systemic and structural problem? And that's a very hard question for folks to ask themselves and to sit with. And this is applicable to all different forms of identity. So when we're talking about or debating about how people of a different identity should or can interact with different systems, we have to really be asking ourselves what is our positionality, and even processing that. Yeah. So that critical self-awareness is key.
Yeah. And I think,
that's okay. I think it was picking up on these.
Kind of going off of that question, I have kind of my own question And I think what you said about knowing your own place kind of will help in answering this, but I think it might be even a little deeper than that. And it's kind of just if you have any advice or guidance in engaging, because everyone who, you know, may be on this call may already be doing the work or trying to do the work. So I think the hard part that I've been trying to ask myself is, how do we engage the people who don't want to do the work or don't think that it needs to be done?
Yeah. Yeah. And so the reason why I particularly appreciate that question, a lot of times the place where we'll go into that conversation is trying to convince someone else of someone else's reality, right? Like, you don't understand these things. This is what these folks go through. And it is important to uphold people's realities and to have those conversations. But with people who don't even want to engage in that conversation, then the conversation needs to be about themselves. And if this is someone who you have a relationship with and you care about them, then it's a conversation about how they see the world, how they are interacting with with society, because it might be that they have bought into this idea that they are better than, that they deserve more, that other people deserve less. And that is a self-processing place to start. You can't just jump into a conversation about other people's humanity when you have barriers to seeing yourself as better than other people, right? So I think that when you're looking to have a conversation with someone who's just rejecting everything that you're bringing to them about someone else's form of oppression, then the question really needs to be, about that person's self-perception, of why folks feel as though they are worthy of being heard more than other people. Why do folks think that they deserve to have the conversation to debate these types of issues? How can that person be supported in challenging themselves more first before we even go into the conversation about someone else's humanity?
Right.
Can I ask a question too, piggyback off of I'm wondering, how does that impact ideas around gender? Like you talked about the patriarchate in society, male-dominated society. Can you talk a little bit about that? I would like to learn, what can men do to try and break that obstacle?
Yeah. And our worldviews are shaped by a bunch of different things. When we begin to process how do we understand ourselves in terms of different layers of oppression. There's interpersonal, there's systemic, there's structural. But when we are gathering our norms or our understanding of society, they're being informed by a lot of different things. So to begin to challenge our ideas requires a lot of pulling apart of some of the major aspects of our lives. And so I'm not a male, but one of the things that I've gathered living through society is that there's a very intentional message that is delivered to males about what masculinity looks like in society. And so to be able to even engage in a conversation around issues that are affecting women, for some folks, that whole concept, that whole construct needs to begin to be dismantled. And so, for people who aren't even at the place of being able to have a conversation about someone else's humanity, that might look like, from a gender perspective, really challenging. Where do you get your concept about what it means to be female or man? Or what beliefs do you have that say that men have this particular power or should have this role or should be in these types of positions in society? Where does that come from? And why have you bought into it?
Yeah.
And I hope that in many cases, folks are at a level where they can see the disparity that exists in society and acknowledge that there's something that's going on there. Then they might be able to get into that conversation about what other people's realities are. But there are certainly some folks who aren't even in that space yet. And going to that conversation about, well, there is, there are these gendered issues within our society. They're going to no, it's not really like that.
Right.
Okay. Yes, it is.
Right.
All right, we'll move on to the next question. So we have, can you explain microaggressions in a little more detail or provide examples, and what should you do to change that behavior when it happens?
Yes. Before I answer that, I do see that someone mentioned the crackling noise that they are hearing. So I think that's because of all of us being unmuted at the same time. So
yeah, maybe just mute ourselves while she answers this question. Is that okay, Ashley?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So, so microaggressions comes out of scholarship that was quite prominent in the civil rights era, late 1960s, early 1970s. A scholar named Chester Pierce coined the term microaggression. And microaggression at the time was really utilized to describe the changes in how people were being discriminated against when forms of overt, blatant forms of racism were outlawed and people were perpetuating forms of racism on a subtle basis. So I can't tell you that you can't come into this restaurant, but I'm going to make you feel unwelcome here. And so the term microaggression began to describe the slights, the intentional put downs, the degradation of people that was experienced that created this new form of racism that was being experienced by folk. The term microaggressions has been developing continuously since the 1970s, and certainly now encompasses and relates to a bunch of different identity groups. And so a lot of times when people think about microaggressions, it's often conflated with examples of like discrimination. So in our lives, we're inevitably and unfortunately going to experience someone who says something mean, bigoted, discriminatory, prejudicial to us, and that is not okay. It is also important to distinguish between when we have those types of forms of discrimination that we experience and whether it's something that is a communicated message that is repeatedly being shared with you that begins to create some form of an internalized experience of oppression. So I think there's folks in here who have been in a class with me know that I like to describe microaggressions as something that is so repeated that it becomes normalized, but it becomes a reality. So if I am continuously conveying this message that, you know, women aren't supposed to speak out. Women aren't supposed to speak out in different ways throughout my life. You're not, where are you from? You're not supposed, you know, you're not from the US, you don't belong here, but where are you from? Even if it is suggested with a positive tone, you're really pretty for a Black woman. You know, these are examples of microaggressions. We tend to look at them as like isolated comments, but really what makes it a microaggression is that it's a message that is continuously communicated to a person throughout their lifespan that creates this deeper level wound and is in actuality a very serious form of oppression. Yeah, thanks for that question. I'll let Justin.
That was good because I think we could hear you better, so that was perfect. And then do you see Ron's comment about intersect religion and faith into intersectionality? Do you want to speak on that a bit?
Yeah, I can. So certainly, I'm interpreting that to be, can we address the importance or the critical need to bring religion into conversations about religion and religious identity, religious oppression, into conversations about intersectionality. And absolutely, that is something that when I teach or when I'm having those conversations in my classrooms, we'll talk about forms of religious oppression and identities that are systemically and structurally oppressed tend to be very prominent in the way that which people experience intersectional identities. Yeah, so certainly not to be excluded, and I think the person who brings that to the table, that we do need to have more conversations about how gender and religion, how age and religion, how race and gender come together to create intersectionalized oppression for folk. I also see two other questions in the chat.
Yeah, do you want, I think since everyone can see those questions in the chat, do you want me to read them out loud or do you want to?
So I can just jump into it.
Yeah, go
ahead. So there's a comment in the chat, and it talks about Breonna Taylor. I'm assuming that's supposed to say Breonna Taylor, talking about, asking the question about why are the failures to charge of action. Is it because she's Black, a woman, no justice being pursued because of that? It's in this part, and Kenneth is expressing that that Breonna Taylor is being devalued and not as important, and that they've lost sight to the crime to her. And I think that this question came in earlier when we were talking about intersectionality and forms of male-dominated society and narratives, and absolutely, this is a critical conversation that we need to be having. We need to be talking about why it is taking so long, why policy, people who are able to influence or change policy, those who have been advocating for it haven't been listened to, and why people who have the ability to shift the policy who are not responding to Breonna Taylor in the same way, Breonna Taylor's death in the same way, the murder of Breonna Taylor in the same way that we're looking at other issues. So I think I see it as more of a comment than necessarily a question, because if I had the answer to that, I would be the first person to ensure that Breonna Taylor received justice. And I think that's the critical conversation we need to be having. That is the place of discomfort. Why is it that this injustice is being ignored, and make sure that we are unapologetic, relentless about ensuring that something is done and that justice is brought around her murder. Yeah.
And then do you want to get the last one in the chat, and then I can unmute Kenya and she can ask her question out loud, okay?
Oh, yeah, perfect. Alan asks, should those who identify as white first identify as being a race, should they start the conversation about race is not only about the other? So there's a question that came into the panelists that talks about should white people begin the conversation about race as identifying themselves as being a race, so that the conversation isn't about the other. And I think that is a conversation I've been having a lot lately, is that when we're talking about American, we're really talking about synonymous with white. And when we're talking about issues as African American or Asian American or Native American, which we refer to as Indigenous or First Nation folk, there is an othering that comes into the conversation about race. What I would say is that when we look at how race was constructed, and I don't know if I'm able to provide more resources, but I encourage people to look at how race itself was constructed. When we look at it, it is served a very intentional function of othering people. So I think that in engaging with that conversation about how race was constructed and bringing into the conversation about how having it allows us to other people is a very important place to start. So I think the person who brought that into the chat, I also apologize. I thought that everyone could see the comments, but okay. Yeah, I see now.
All right, awesome. So then, Kenya, I am going to... Kenya, go ahead. I think, there you go.
Hi, Kenya.
Hi. I didn't have a question, though.
Oh, you didn't? I'm sorry. I thought you raised your hand.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to raise my hand.
No, that's okay. No problem. No problem. You're good. I'll get you back.
It's nice to see you, Kenya.
All right. So I think probably have time for another question, maybe two, if anyone. Oh, it's 1:59. My computer time is off. Oh, last question coming in, book suggestions for boards. And I'm wondering.
Yeah, I'm wondering. So I do have a list of book suggestions that I am developing. Also, folks are welcome to, I'm not sure if my email address was included, but people are more than welcome to email me if you have any additional questions that we weren't able to respond to. If you email Dr. Ashley E. Stewart at gmail.com. It'll come to me, and I'm happy to provide anybody with any, like, if you have a specific question about something I discussed today, I'm very, very happy to be able to provide that. And I know that you all have my Temple email address. You're more than welcome to put that into the chat as well. But there are a lot of great books. It would more so, I don't know what for boards means. I'm assuming that's a typo. I'm looking at my keyboard to see what letters are near that. But I don't want to just start reading off a bunch of books because I have like a wide range of books on the topic.
Actually, I think, and I could be wrong, and maybe Lindsay, you could clarify. I'm wondering if she means like a board of directors.
Oh, for boards of directors. Oh, yes. I do. I actually do. So I would, Lindsay, I would really, okay, perfect. Yes, I have some books, and I also have some very specific readings that folks have found really helpful. So I would love to send those to you, Lindsay. If you were able to reach out somehow, I'll be happy to share that with you.
All right, and then let me just read this last part. Apart from the solution to start the conversation is to identify the origins of race, specifically the origins of the group called white people, will change the narrative and the perceptions and the reality around race. Thank you. Okay, awesome. I wasn't sure if there was a question attached to that, but
reiterating the point that was made earlier. Thank you for putting that into the chat and having it so that folks can read it as well. Appreciate that.
Definitely. So I think we can wrap up. I'll personally say thank you so much for being here, and I'll let you kind of close us out.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again, echo what Jess said. Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for being a part of this important conversation, for helping us to grow as participants and dealing with difficult conversations around inequity in society. So I think we're better off, we're more informed for having participated in this conversation. And I know the committee wanted me to share this with you. You're always welcome to be a part of the YWCA, our future stuff that we want to do around social justice work, because we value the work that you do, and the work you do is really important. So thank you, Dr. Stewart, for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much enjoyed this conversation and look forward to having conversations with you all in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you to our guests. Have a good weekend.